The moment Paul Heyman dropped to his knees and looked Roman Reigns directly in the eyes with an expression that nobody in that arena could quite decipher, every single person watching professional wrestling that night understood they were witnessing something that would fundamentally alter the landscape of WWE for a very long time to come. Welcome back to WWE Frenzy, the home for breaking down every jaw-dropping, mind-bending, completely unpredictable moment that professional wrestling has thrown at us recently, and today we are diving into one of the most talked about, most analyzed, most passionately debated segments in recent WWE history because what Paul Heyman did after Roman Reigns captured his Royal Rumble victory has shaken up absolutely everything we thought we understood about loyalty, strategy, and the incredibly dangerous game that the Advocate has been playing behind the scenes for longer than most people actually realized. Let me take you back to the exact moment this all unfolded because the build-up to those few minutes of television is actually just as important as the segment itself, and understanding everything that led to Heyman's stunning decision helps explain why this particular betrayal hit so much harder than the dozens of other faction-related twists that happen throughout any given wrestling year. The Royal Rumble main event had just concluded with Roman Reigns standing victorious, the crowd still buzzing with residual energy from witnessing one of the most compelling performances of his career, and the arena was in that perfect state of emotional elevation where anything that happened next was going to feel amplified beyond its normal impact. Roman was in the ring, chest heaving, soaking in the victory, and for the briefest of moments everything felt straightforward and celebratory, like the night was simply going to end on a high note and everyone could go home satisfied. Then the music stopped, and Paul Heyman appeared at the top of the ramp. My roommate Derek and I had been watching together all night, sitting through every single match from start to finish, and we had spent most of the evening discussing how the Vision's influence over WWE programming had become genuinely suffocating in the weeks leading up to the Royal Rumble. Derek had actually predicted earlier that evening that the night would end with Roman's victory serving as some kind of catalyst for a major shakeup in the faction dynamics, but even his prediction didn't come anywhere close to capturing the actual enormity of what Paul Heyman was about to do. The two of us were mid-conversation about grabbing food after the show when Heyman's music hit, and both of us simultaneously fell completely silent and turned our full attention back to the television because we both instinctively understood that something significant was about to happen. Heyman walked down that ramp with a completely different energy than anything he had displayed throughout his entire tenure as the Vision's architect. There was no confident swagger, no calculated theatrical performance designed to intimidate opponents or project an image of untouchable intelligence. Instead, he carried himself with this almost reluctant weight, like someone approaching a conversation they had been dreading, like someone who had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment but still felt the gravity of it pressing down on every single step. The crowd was confused, genuinely uncertain about what they were watching, and that confusion created a silence that somehow felt louder than any crowd noise could have managed. Roman watched him approach with an expression that shifted through about 6 different emotions in the span of maybe 10 seconds. Suspicion came first, naturally, because Roman Reigns is not someone who trusts easily, and Paul Heyman had been operating as the guiding force behind a faction that had been causing problems for virtually everyone on the roster. Then came something that looked almost like recognition, like Roman was seeing something in Heyman's demeanor that told him this wasn't an attack or an attempted manipulation but something else entirely, something that required a completely different response than anything Roman had been prepared to deliver that night. Heyman got in the ring, and the entire building held its collective breath. He walked to the center, stood directly in front of Roman, and then did something that honestly made me grab my phone to make sure I was seeing this correctly and not somehow hallucinating from exhaustion because I had been watching wrestling for the better part of 6 hours straight. He dropped. Not fell, not stumbled, not collapsed from some kind of physical ailment. He deliberately, intentionally, with full awareness of exactly what the gesture meant, lowered himself to his knees directly in front of the man he had previously been working against through every strategic decision the Vision had made. Derek literally said nothing for about 15 seconds, which is remarkable because Derek is someone who commentates on literally everything that happens in any room he occupies at essentially all times. The silence from him told me more about how shocking this moment was than any verbal reaction could have communicated. My phone was already buzzing with messages from wrestling friends across the country, everyone sending variations of the same disbelieving reaction, everyone simultaneously trying to process what they were seeing and figure out whether this was genuinely happening or some elaborate setup for an even bigger twist down the line. Heyman spoke, and the microphone picked up enough of his words that the audience could follow the general thread of what he was saying even though the full conversation wasn't completely audible in every corner of that massive arena. He apologized. Not in the performative, theatrical way that wrestling characters typically express regret as part of a larger narrative strategy, but with a sincerity that cut through every layer of kayfabe and artificial performance and reached something that felt genuinely human underneath all the years of calculated manipulation and strategic positioning. The words themselves were simple, almost uncomfortably so for someone whose entire career has been built on elaborate verbal construction and psychological warfare, but their simplicity was precisely what gave them their devastating impact. I've been following Paul Heyman's career for the better part of 15 years, from his legendary time running ECW where he essentially invented an entirely new approach to professional wrestling entertainment, through his various management roles on WWE's main roster, through his current positioning as one of the most important non-wrestling performers in the history of the business. I have studied his promos, analyzed his strategic decisions, read everything available about his approach to storytelling and character development. In all of that time, across all of those different eras and partnerships and creative evolutions, I have never once seen Paul Heyman appear vulnerable. Never once seen him in a position where he wasn't firmly in control of the narrative, firmly operating from a position of intellectual superiority, firmly projecting an image of someone who always has the next move planned 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Watching him kneel in front of Roman Reigns and deliver that apology shattered every single expectation I had built about this man over more than a decade of observation, and that kind of genuine surprise from someone who has spent years specifically studying professional wrestling is extraordinarily difficult to achieve. The backstage dynamics leading up to this moment have become significantly clearer in the days following the Royal Rumble as various reports and insider accounts have filtered through the wrestling community. Multiple credible sources have indicated that Heyman's decision to betray the vision and align himself with Roman was not a sudden impulse but rather the culmination of weeks of internal deliberation, weeks during which Heyman was essentially running parallel calculations about where his future interests were best served. The vision had been his project, his creation, something he had invested enormous amounts of creative energy and strategic intelligence into building from the ground up. Abandoning that investment required genuine justification, required a compelling enough reason to walk away from something he had constructed with such meticulous care. Roman apparently represented that justification in ways that went beyond simple competitive advantage or positioning within WWE's hierarchy. Sources suggest that there were personal conversations between Heyman and Roman that occurred well before the Royal Rumble, conversations that planted the seeds for the eventual reunion without either party committing to anything concrete until the timing felt absolutely right. The Royal Rumble victory itself served as the catalyst that transformed those preliminary discussions into decisive action, giving Heyman the confidence that Roman was genuinely back at the level where their partnership could achieve the kind of results that justified burning down everything Heyman had previously built. My friend Christina, who teaches communications at the local college and has a genuine academic interest in rhetoric and persuasion, actually watched the segment with me on replay later that evening and spent about 40 minutes analyzing specifically the way Heyman delivered his apology. She pointed out that the effectiveness of the moment relied on Heyman abandoning virtually every rhetorical technique he typically employs, stripping away the verbal complexity and theatrical confidence that normally define his communication style and replacing them with something raw and unadorned that forced the audience to engage with the emotional content rather than being distracted by the technical craftsmanship of the delivery. Coming from someone who studies communication professionally, that observation carries genuine weight and helps explain why the segment resonated so deeply with audiences who might not have been able to articulate exactly why it affected them the way it did. The reaction from the Vision's remaining members following Heyman's public betrayal has been absolutely fascinating to track over the days since the Royal Rumble, and the storyline possibilities that have opened up as a direct result of his departure from the group are genuinely exciting from a creative storytelling perspective. The faction that had been operating with ruthless efficiency, making calculated decisions based on Heyman's strategic guidance, suddenly finds itself without the intellectual engine that made everything they did work so effectively. They're not physically diminished in any meaningful way, still possess some of the most talented and imposing wrestlers on the current roster, but their ability to think 3 steps ahead, to anticipate threats before they materialize, to construct elaborate plans that neutralize opposition before it can even organize, all of that disappears the moment Heyman walks out the door. I remember watching a documentary about the history of professional wrestling factions several years back, and one of the key points made by multiple experts interviewed throughout the film was that the most successful groups in wrestling history weren't defined primarily by the physical talent they contained but rather by the quality of their leadership and strategic direction. The Four Horsemen had Ric Flair's political savvy. D-Generation X had Triple H's ruthless ambition. The NWO had the Hollywood connection and the willingness to break every rule that existed. The Vision had Paul Heyman, and the moment that leadership vacuum was created, the clock started ticking on their ability to maintain the level of dominance they had enjoyed for months. Heyman's departure doesn't just weaken the Vision, it fundamentally undermines the structural foundation upon which their entire operation was built. Roman's reaction to Heyman's apology and subsequent alignment deserves equal analysis because the way the tribal chief responded communicated volumes about where this particular partnership is heading and what Roman's mindset is as he moves forward from the Royal Rumble. He didn't immediately embrace Heyman, didn't rush to make the situation comfortable or eliminate any residual tension from their previous adversarial positioning. Instead, he took his time, studied Heyman carefully, and when he finally acknowledged the apology and extended his hand, the gesture carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what he was accepting and exactly what it meant for his future trajectory within WWE. Tyler, a kid from my neighborhood who I've been watching wrestling with occasionally over the past several months, was at my place when I rewatched the segment for what was probably the 8th or 9th time since the Royal Rumble. Tyler is 14 and represents the kind of next-generation wrestling fan whose engagement with the product is shaped entirely by the current era rather than nostalgia for previous generations of storytelling. His reaction to the Heyman segment was interesting precisely because it was different from the reaction of older fans who immediately recognized the historical significance of the reunion. Tyler was focused entirely on the emotional content of the moment, on the vulnerability Heyman displayed, on the human drama of someone admitting they had been wrong and seeking to make things right. That generational difference in how the same moment lands tells you something important about the universal storytelling principles that WWE managed to tap into with this particular segment. The business implications of Roman and Heyman reuniting cannot be overstated when you consider the track record of their previous partnership and what that history suggests about the commercial potential of their renewed collaboration. Roman's championship reign with Heyman orchestrating his approach was one of the most commercially successful periods in recent WWE history, driving pay-per-view numbers, merchandise sales, and overall audience engagement to levels that the company had struggled to replicate with other talent and other storyline constructions. The audience clearly responded to the combination of Roman's physical dominance and Heyman's intellectual manipulation in ways that transcended the usual fan reactions to individual performers, creating something that was genuinely greater than the sum of its individual parts. The storytelling architecture that this reunion establishes for the coming months is incredibly rich with possibility and creative potential. Roman with Heyman at his side represents a version of the tribal chief that the current roster simply has no adequate answer for, which creates an immediate hierarchy problem that WWE will need to address through increasingly creative and compelling television. The Vision needs to respond to Heyman's betrayal in some fashion that justifies their continued existence as a faction and provides them with a meaningful narrative purpose beyond simply existing as victims of their former architect's calculated abandonment. And Heyman himself needs to eventually explain, in more detail than the Royal Rumble segment allowed, exactly what his ultimate endgame is and why Roman Reigns represents the vehicle he chose to pursue it. My dad, who was a dedicated wrestling fan during the late 90s and early 2000s before gradually stepping back as his schedule got busier, called me after seeing clips from the Royal Rumble circulating on social media. He specifically wanted to talk about the Heyman segment because he remembered the original Roman and Heyman partnership vividly and was genuinely excited about the reunion. He made an observation that stuck with me, pointing out that Heyman's apology works on multiple levels simultaneously because even though we know this is professional wrestling entertainment, the act of a proud, intelligent, strategically minded person publicly acknowledging that they made a mistake and seeking forgiveness taps into something deeply human that resonates regardless of the fictional framework surrounding it. The promo work that Heyman is going to need to deliver in the weeks following the Royal Rumble to properly establish the context and motivation behind his betrayal of the Vision represents one of the most fascinating creative challenges currently facing WWE's writing team. Heyman's verbal abilities are arguably unmatched in the history of professional wrestling. His capacity to construct compelling narratives through spoken word alone has been demonstrated repeatedly throughout his career, and the material he's been given to work with here is genuinely exceptional. Explaining why someone who spent months building a faction suddenly abandoned everything they created requires nuanced storytelling that goes beyond simple power dynamics or competitive advantage, requires exploring psychological complexity and personal motivation in ways that most wrestling promos never even attempt. The fan community has been engaged in passionate debate about whether Heyman's actions represent a genuine character shift or simply another layer of his perpetual strategic maneuvering, and honestly both interpretations have compelling evidence supporting them. If this is simply Heyman playing chess at a higher level than everyone else, operating from a position of calculated self-interest the way he has throughout his entire career, then the betrayal of the Vision was always going to happen the moment a better opportunity presented itself. If this represents something more personal, something that suggests Heyman's relationship with Roman actually matters to him on a level beyond professional utility, then we're seeing a side of Paul Heyman that has never been properly explored and that could produce some of the most compelling character work of his entire career. The wrestling community online has been split almost exactly down the middle on the question of whether Heyman's apology felt genuine or performed, and that ambiguity is actually precisely what makes the segment so effective and so rewatchable. Great professional wrestling storytelling thrives in the space between certainty and doubt, creates engagement by giving the audience enough information to form opinions while withholding enough to keep them invested in discovering the complete truth. Heyman's apology exists perfectly in that ambiguous space where reasonable people can disagree about its sincerity without either interpretation being definitively correct, and that quality alone elevates it above the vast majority of similar segments that wrestling produces throughout any given year. What keeps drawing me back to this moment, what makes me want to create content about it and discuss it endlessly with other fans, is the reminder it provides about why professional wrestling can be genuinely compelling entertainment when the people involved understand exactly what they're doing and care deeply about the quality of the experience they're creating for the audience. Paul Heyman dropping to his knees in front of Roman Reigns wasn't just a plot development in an ongoing storyline, it was a piece of art that demonstrated the highest level of professional wrestling craftsmanship, that showed what happens when incredibly talented performers are given material worthy of their abilities and the creative freedom to execute it with authenticity and emotional honesty. The path forward for this reunion is going to be absolutely riveting to follow, and WWE Frenzy is going to be covering every single development with the detailed analysis and passionate engagement that this storyline genuinely deserves. Whether Roman and Heyman reconstruct the same kind of dominant force they previously built together, whether the partnership evolves into something entirely new and unexpected, whether the Vision finds a way to strike back and potentially disrupt the reunion before it fully takes hold, all of these questions and dozens more are going to be answered over the coming weeks and months of WWE programming. So here is exactly what I need every single one of you to do right now before you navigate away from this video. Scroll down to those comments and share your completely honest, unfiltered reaction to Paul Heyman's apology and his betrayal of the Vision following Roman's Royal Rumble victory. Did the apology feel genuine to you, or do you think Heyman is simply playing another calculated game? Are you excited about this reunion, or does something about it feel off to you? Do you think the Vision deserved better from the man they trusted completely? These conversations are the lifeblood of this community. These debates and discussions are the entire reason WWE Frenzy continues to grow and thrive, and your voices genuinely influence the content we create moving forward. Subscribe to the channel right now if you haven't already done so, because comprehensive coverage of every single development in this Roman and Heyman story is coming soon. Smash that notification bell so you're among the very first to know when new content drops, because in a storyline this layered and this unpredictable, significant developments emerge constantly. Share this video with every wrestling fan you know, with people who might have missed the Royal Rumble, with anyone who appreciates genuinely shocking and emotionally resonant storytelling executed at the absolute highest possible level. Paul Heyman just made the biggest move of his career, and WWE Frenzy is going to be documenting every single consequence until this extraordinary chapter of professional wrestling history reaches its ultimate conclusion.